Ladies and gentlemen, I can't tell you how pleased I am to find myself here. This is truly the eye of the world's desiring. It's the place where one begins to wish to be a Byzantinist. It's the place where one continues to wish to be Byzantinist. It's the place where one has been glad to be a Byzantinist. And it's a place where in the library you learn you're never Byzantinist enough. I'm talking about what could be called a Western topic, but in the 5th century such distinctions did not yet reach their full profile. I'm talking of the Western end of the Orbis Terrarum, subject to the laws of the Emperor Theodosius II of Constantinople, even if, as this paper will show, it was the more ragged end of this Orbis, but nonetheless interesting. What I want this afternoon to do is to attempt to catch behind the surface of a much-read text the sharp profile of the author himself. Salvian of Marseilles has long been known to us through one book in particular, his De Gubernatione Dei, his On the Government, that is, on the providential rule of God, which he wrote at some time after 439, probably in the early 440s. This book provides the most vivid and by far the best known commentary on the state of the Western Roman Empire in the 430s and the 440s. Edward Gibbon had already seen all that we still see in Salvian. In the sombre conclusion to the 35th chapter of the Decline and Fall of the Roman Empire, Gibbon wrote that the Romans had long attempted to predict the end of their empire on the basis of the 12 vultures who had flown above the head of Romulus. By the 5th century AD, the 12 centuries hinted at by those prophetic birds seemed to be running out. But the fall of Rome, Gibbon wrote, was announced by a clearer omen than the flight of vultures. The Roman government appeared every day less formidable to its enemies, more odious and oppressive to its subjects. The taxes multiplied with the public distress, economy was neglected in proportion as it became necessary, and the injustice of the rich shifted the unequal burden from themselves to the humbler people. The severe Inquisition connected with the taxes compelled the subjects of Valentinian III to prefer the more simple tyranny of the barbarians. They abjured and abhorred the name of Roman citizens, which had formerly excited the ambition of mankind. Indeed, Gibbon concludes, if all the barbarian conquerors had been annihilated in the same hour, their total destruction would not have restored the empire of the West. And if Rome still survived, she survived the loss of freedom, of virtue, and of honor. A contemporary of more efficient authoritarian regimes, Gibbon went on to observe in a footnote that Salvian's immoderate freedom serves to prove the weakness as well as the corruption of the Roman government. In his own times, Gibbon implied, a writer of such vehement invectives would have ended up in the Bastille. Now he ends up in footnotes. References to the De Gubernatione add the final touch to any grand narrative of the end of the empire in the West. To take one example only, Salvian provides for Geisa Alföldi a gloomy picture of the failing Roman state. He uses Salvian to bring his short social history of Rome to a suitably depressing conclusion. Salvian has become for us a mere source. He is not often considered as a person. In fact, Salvian was a vivid person with his own idiosyncratic take on the problems of his day. He probably wrote in Marseilles, and certainly for the sancti, for the religiously inclined, the clergy, the monks and pious lay persons of southern Gaul in the late 430s and early 440s. He should not be treated as a witness to the ills of the later Roman Empire as a whole, in all places and in all centuries, as he is often made to do. Rather, in his writings, we can catch the precise hopes and fears of a particular group at a particular juncture in the crisis of the empire, of what he calls the res publica, and in a particular region. It's this juncture which we must first understand. By the late 430s, it was plain that what had once been a universal empire had begun to unravel. Salvian looked out at a world where the res publica was only one power among others. Beyond Provence and the southern valley of the Rhone lay barbarian kingdoms in the making, both in Aquitaine and in western Spain. Further to the northwest, towards the English Channel and in marginal areas of Spain, lay ominous stateless zones, associated in the public mind at least with the Bacaudi. Far to the south, across the Mediterranean, Africa had recently fallen to the Vandals. Salvian wrote no longer for the citizens of a world empire, but for the inhabitants of an enclave in which the grandeur of an ancien regime still lingered with peculiar intensity. A visitor to Dumbarton Oaks would think naturally of that vivid string of enclaves clinging to the coasts of the Aegean and the Black Sea from Mistra to Trebizond that characterized the Byzantine Empire in its hectic last days. He wrote to warn the inhabitants of this enclave that the Roman order of which they were so proud hung on a thread, and why that was so. To this task he brought both his own experience and the experience of the vocal group for whom he wrote. First, he himself was a refugee from the Rhineland. By moving to the deep south of Gaul, he as it were voted with his feet for the res publica. Not all members of his family had followed him. A female relative with her son, a boy of not insignificant family, had stayed on in Cologne. Now, too poor to move, she was condemned to work for a living, or so Salvian claimed. She depended on the good graces of ladies from the new Frankish elite. But already the begging letter which Salvian wrote to his fellow sancti on her behalf reveals a grey zone. A grey zone where the old categories of Roman and barbarian no longer quite fitted. For this distressed lady had not been made a captive by the barbarians. Therefore she was not automatically eligible for ransom from the funds of the church. She and her son had to be treated as special cases, for she represented a new class of persons, Romans ilic, Romans over there. It's a term which recurs in Salvian's De Gubernatione with ominous frequency, for it meant Romans where no Romans, other than captives held against their will, should be. Second, let us think of Salvian's audience. Here it's worthwhile noting that Gennadius of Marseilles, in his catalogue of famous writers of around 490, calls Salvian a magister episcoporum, a teacher of bishops. Now, the recent study of Roberto Alciati, Monaci, Vescovi e Scuola nella Gallia Tardo Antica, has enabled us to recapture some of the weight of the term magister as it was used in 5th century Gaul. Bishops and abbots were supposed to be each of them a magister to a whole network of disciples whom they trained in sacred matters. As Alciati shows so very well, the loose literary circles of an earlier age had already come to be crystallized into a series of more stable pyramids of intensive and continued teaching conducted by spiritual mentors. The magistri, the masters, transmitted sacred learning with a seriousness that anticipated the monastic schools gathered around the sapientes of early medieval Ireland. Thus, we should not think of Salvian merely as the author of occasional squibs. As Magister Episcoporum, he was the Tonangeber to a wider group. Salvian's role as magister to the saints also accounts for the encoded audience of his works. We should not think of Salvian addressing a wide circle of readers. Rather, we are listening to an intrasectarian debate. It was a debate conducted by saints for saints. Put bluntly, in such circles one could never be quite saint enough to please all the other saints. And least of all did the present state of the Church please those who insisted on absolute authenticity in their Christian vocation. For this reason, Salvian's first book, his Ad Ecclesiam, his open letter to the Church, written in around 435, already sets the tone for the De Gubernatione. He saw the Church itself as lying in the shadow of a great regret. A chasm had opened up between the present state of Christianity and the imagined perfection of the first Christians. This acute sense of decline arose from a tension within the ranks of the sancti themselves. Salvian's idealization of the Ecclesia Primitiva, the Church in its first state, reflects debates in Marseilles already stirred by the writings on monasticism of John Cassian. What both men proposed was a fundamentally monastic vision of the primitive church. As they read it described in chapters 2 and 4 of the Acts of the Apostles, the first Christians of Jerusalem appeared both to Cassian and to Salvian to have lived in a monastic utopia. All goods had been held in common. All had lived in a state of total poverty, as if in a gigantic Lérins, supported, as Lérins was largely supported, by the wealth handed over to the community by new rich converts. The issue was how much of this original perfection of the Church could be recaptured in modern times. John Cassian had allowed himself to be optimistic on this point. In his view, a precious remnant of the first solidarity of Christians appeared to have survived, despite a massive cooling off of zeal among the majority of believers. It was still to be found in the monasteries of Egypt, and might yet be renewed in properly founded monasteries in Gaul. Salvian, by contrast, made plain that he considered that this perfection had all but totally vanished. That exceptional and outstanding blessedness, which once the first community, the primitiva plebs, had enjoyed, has passed away. How different the Christian people are now from what they had been. In a new and hitherto unheard of manner, the Church wanes as it reaches its fullness, slipping back as it advances. For Salvian, the vibrant image of the primitive Church hovered above his age as a permanent rebuke. It was a sort of historical superego. In writing in this way, Salvian was not only influenced by John Cassian, he knew his Roman historians. He knew above all Sallust. He believed, like Sallust, that a moment of virtuous collective poverty had lain at the root of the former greatness of Rome. He treated the early Roman Republic as if it had been a lay version of the primitive Church. What its heroes had done then, those Christians who truly followed Christ, his sancti, mainly, though not exclusively monks, were supposed to do now. The decline of the Church, like the decline of Rome, could be ascribed to the same dire cause, to a loss of ancient virtue, due to the corruption of wealth. But, as Sir Ronald Syme has reminded us when writing of the historian Sallust, when Roman writers use the language of ancient virtue, it is time to pause and look again. And what Salvian meant by ancient virtue was not only the virtue of poverty, it was the virtue of a Church which had once been able to pray effectively for the res publica. The Church had lost the power to do this in modern times. Once a placatrix, a body capable of placating the wrath of God, the Church had become the opposite, an exacerbatrix, a community which stirred up his wrath against them for their sins. This emphasis on the wrath of God against the Church, rather than his denunciations of the social ills of the declining Roman Empire, would have struck contemporary readers as the most chilling aspect of his message. It was not the res publica, it was the Church itself which was the sick man of Europe. In writing in this way, Salvian pointedly disassociated himself from the incipient Christian patriotism of many of his contemporaries in the territories of the res publica. Now, we who read Salvian's On the Government of God with the advantage of hindsight tend to treat the Roman Empire of the late 430s as already a doomed institution, but this was not how it appeared to many contemporaries. After the 430s and in the 440s, they were seen by many as a time of consolidation after the terrible events of the early 5th century. Having experienced widespread violence, the Christian communities of southern Gaul had begun to dig in. For the first time in their history, the cities of Gaul gained major cathedrals. This defiant mood prevailed in cities all over the Western Empire, and most especially in cities that stood near the frontiers of the Res Publica. Now buried in the long grass beside the Christian basilica at Salona, modern Solun, on the Dalmatian coast of Croatia, a little bit north of Split, lay a lintel which declared in large capitals, Deus noster propitius esto Rei Publicae Romanae. My God, may you be propitious to the Roman state. Salvian's answer was a firm no. God would not be propitious to the Res Publica. The De Gubernatione was an icy blast directed against the mood of recovery and consolidation which had comforted Salvian's compatriots at just this time. Now, why did he do this? We must remember that the De Gubernatione was known at the time as a book De Praesenti Judicio, on judgment in the here and now. An overpowering sense of the imminent presence of God as the judge of human sins, not a modern historian's sense of the abuses of Roman society, was what drove Salvian to produce his tract for the times. It is precisely in his insistence on the judgment of God that Salvian emerged as a writer who was as powerful as he was idiosyncratic. We can seize the sharpness of his profile if we compare it with the views of his contemporaries among the saints in Provence. For Eucharius of Lyon, for instance, the ills of the present age merely proved that Christians lived in the old age of the world. It was better for them to think of their own old age and approaching death than to focus on the ills of Roman society. Indeed, seen from a monastery, the world could seem a somewhat diaphanous place. To use the beautiful simile of Valerianus of Simies, the bishop of a little town perched in the mountains behind Nice, the secular world was as pallid as a moon in the morning sky. Not so for Salvian. The world was only too real and only too plainly out of joint. Like a relentless investigative cameraman, he held his focus with fierce determination on the real ills of a real empire. He did so in order to persuade his readers that they were in the presence of a God who judged human sins in the here and now with terrifying particularity and appositeness. In this respect, Salvian was part of what Conrad Leiser, in his entry on semi-Pelagianism in the Encyclopedia Augustine Through the Ages, has judiciously called a Gallic consensus on theology. This consensus included a strong sense of the unrelenting rigor of the law of God, which resembled the insistence on total obedience to the law of God that had been put forward only a generation previously in Pelagian writings that were known in Marseilles. God's law was clear for all to obey, and so God's judgment for breaches of this law was also clear for all to see. A terrible sense of what Jan Bardevine has called the rationale transparence, of the rationality and transparency of the justice of God, made the government of God quite unlike any contemporary tract. Why was this remorselessly precise logic of crime and punishment so important to Salvian? I suspect that it was because at the back of his mind there lay a lingering conviction that in some way or other the Roman Empire was the Israel of modern times. Like the ancient Israel, it was a state subject to the peculiar care of God. As David Lambert has made plain, Salvian thought of the Christian empire of the 5th century as an avatar of the kingdom of Israel. Says Lambert, it had become a politico-religious entity of the same kind as Israel under Moses. The res publica was an Israel writ large. But Salvian's message was so terrible because he claimed that the Christian empire was indeed an Israel, but it was a failed Israel. Its inhabitants had rejected the opportunity to be an Israel obedient to the law. For this reason, they lived in an Israel deserted by God. Vos non estis populus meus. You are not my people. The words of the prophet Hosea to an abandoned Israel summed up for Salvian the extent of the peril which the surviving res publica now faced. It was an Israel in its last days. Now, in order to write in this way, Salvian deliberately brushed aside alternative, more comforting ways of seeing his world. It's instructive to compare him for a moment with a writer quite as pugnacious as he was, who had raised a stir in Marseille a decade earlier. The Augustinian ultra prosper of Aquitaine. In the years when Salvian was writing the De Gubernatione, Prosper of Aquitaine had completed his chronicle and was writing the De Vocatione Omnium Gentium, on the calling of all nations. For Prosper, the workings of God's mighty grace in the Church had effectively cut the history of Christianity loose from the history of the empire. Prosper's world of pure grace was a world with no center, like sudden flashes of light dancing on the surface of an immense, unfathomed ocean. Grace could shine out anywhere. The hand of God was as likely to be set to work on the shores of Ireland as in Provence. And in any case, the workings of God's providence were beyond human scrutiny. A velvet opacity screened the relation between sin and judgment. Nothing could be more different from Prosper's serene mystification of the workings of grace than the remorseless transparency with which Salvian traced every present disaster to the judgment of God in the here and now. Nor did the centerless world of Prosper mean anything to Salvian. His view of this res publica as an avatar of the kingdom of Israel kept his attention focused on the territories of the empire. For it was there that the law of God should have been observed in its fullness, and so it was there that the blows of God's judgment had fallen with terrible force, and in a manner that was only too intelligible. So let us end by lingering over two well-known examples of Salvian at work on themes which have fueled debate among modern historians. First, let us look at one revealing aspect of Salvian's attitude to the barbarians. The sound and fury of past debates on whether Salvian was pro-barbarian or anti-barbarian, whether he remained a loyal subject of the res publica, or whether he perceived in the makeshift power blocks of his own time the outlines of the Germanic Europe of the early Middle Ages, have led us to ignore what was truly original in his approach. Salvian proposed for the very first time a novel map of Gaul. This was a strictly moral map. What he wanted to trace upon it were the differing shades of knowledge of the law of God. Some groups could claim diminished responsibility. They had not known that law, or had known it only imperfectly, but others, that is the Romans, could make no such claim. They had known the law, they were entirely responsible for their sins, they must face the full rigor of God's judgment. As Michael Maas has made plain in an unusually illuminating article, this involved an imaginative leap of considerable daring. Salvian's map was not like the usual Roman map. It did not divide the world in cultural terms. No chasm stood between the uncivilized barbarian and the civilized Roman. Compared with knowledge of the law of God, such distinctions were unimportant. Salvian's insistence on knowledge of the law of God as the only criterion according to which God judged any human society had the effect of rearranging the barbarian groups as if they lay around the res publica in a series of concentric circles. Gaul was ringed by an outer fringe of unconverted pagan barbarians, Saxons, Huns, Franks, Gepids, Alemanni. They were a supremely nasty lot. Salvian, who had seen them at work along the Rhine, had little use for non-Christian barbarians, but unlike the Romans, they could at least claim ignorance of God's law. For that reason, they would suffer less harsh punishment than would the Romans. Next came an anomalous grey zone. Goths and Vandals were not pagans. They were Christians, but they were misinformed Christians. They were Arian heretics. They did not know the law in its entirety, for it had been passed on to them in garbled form by the wrong magistri, by the wrong teachers. For that reason they could not be judged as harshly for their errors as the Roman Christians would be. They erred in good faith. Only the Catholic Roman Christians of Salvian's old time had no excuse. They could expect no mercy. Now, Salvian, as we all know, was a relentless arguing machine. It was more important for him to show that the Romans deserved punishment than to write a disquisition on the Arianism of the Visigoths. Yet, in a clergyman of the 5th century, this was a strangely laid-back attitude to heresy. It opens at least a chink in the otherwise solid wall of Catholic condemnation. I would suggest that Salvian's attitude to the heretical Arianism of the Vandals, and particularly the Visigoths, may have had its origins in a current debate at Lerins. For in precisely these years, Vincent of Lerins was wrestling in his commonitorium with the problem of non-culpable error within the Catholic Church itself. For Vincent, the history of the Church offered examples of analogous grey zones. Great Christian writers had turned out to be great embarrassments. Tertullian and Origen had both been towering charismatic geniuses and defenders of the Christian faith, but the passing of time had shown that they had allowed a single-minded pursuit of extreme positions to tarnish their orthodoxy. Vincent was convinced that in his own days, Augustine, and especially the image of Augustine that was propounded by his more extreme followers, such as Prosper of Aquitaine, was in danger of becoming another such white elephant of the faith. What is interesting is the very real sympathy with which Vincent wrote of the disillusionment suffered by those who had followed such masters in all innocence. If Catholics could err in a manner that was subject only to the lightest blame, why could not the Visigoths also be seen as holding to the views of their teachers with misplaced but understandable, even pardonable loyalty? In both cases, the terrible hiss of demonic inspiration, which always lay close to discussions of heresy at this time, was totally absent. Salvian's de-dramatized view of the religion of the Visigoths may well have reflected debates within the sancti themselves as to how to view divergences of religious opinion at every level, from a polite winnowing by experts of the works of Augustine to a certain tolerance of the anomalous but real Christian piety of a Visigothic Arian court. In Salvian's view of the world, the barbarians are still one-dimensional figures, though. They appear almost exclusively as the executors of the judgment of God against Romans who had known and abandoned his law. This was not so when he came to the dealings of Romans with themselves. Here he holds his camera very steady, with an unrelenting focus on those current abuses which seem to have brought down upon them the condign punishment from God. So let me end with these. On this issue, Salvian was in many ways thoroughly conventional. The late Roman tax machine, as it had functioned for centuries, lay at the center of his field of vision. Yet his comments were elicited by, again, a precise moment of crisis. From the military point of view, what remained of the res publica had rallied with unexpected vigor in the late 430s. Covering with mobile forces a vast area between the Rhineland and the Danube, Count Aetius had rendered the empire a power still to be reckoned with. In the words of Guy Halsall, Aetius's campaigns amounted to a form of government through punitive expedition. Quite apart from the brutality of such campaigns, they had been extremely costly. The cavalry units used by Aetius were expensive to maintain. A policy based as much on diplomacy as on the use of force drained money in the form of subsidies. Both in Italy and in Gaul, taxes were increased, collected with ever greater fierceness. Old exemptions were pushed aside. In this situation, the tendency of the rich, especially of the high-ups in government circles, to protect themselves against taxation by shifting the burden on to lesser taxpayers became more than usually flagrant and unpopular. A rhetoric of the public good had long been deployed by subjects of the empire in their petitions for tax relief. The same rhetoric was echoed back to taxpayers in imperial edicts. In 441, for instance, the Chancellor Valentinian III denounced tax evaders in the same language as did Salvian. Since they serve only their domestic profits, deprive the common good, in which is contained their true and substantial welfare. The burden which the rich man refuses, only the weaker man bears. Such language shows that Salvian was no innovator. He partook in what Jill Harris has called a widespread culture of criticism, whose principal vehicle had been the opposition. From the groans of the Britons, addressed to Aetius when he was campaigning in Gaul, to the novelle which issued from the court of Ravenna, the atmosphere positively tingled with sound bites of protest. Thus, Salvian was not a lonely voice, nor did he stand alone. His relentless precision on matters of taxation betrays the clear but narrow focus of those who read him. An impoverished local notable himself, he spoke with rare anger on behalf of the petty gentry of the cities, the municipal aristocracies of Gaul. It was members of this class who felt particularly threatened by policies of taxation. It placed them at the mercy of their more ruthless peers. When Salvian spoke of the pauperculi, the poor little guys, who were devastated by high officials, he did not mean the lower classes in the modern sense. They were people like himself. In the 430s, it was they who risked sliding down the steep slope into impoverishment as refugees and as fiscal debtors. Though Salvian seldom lifted his eyes from the brightly lit scene of local city-based extortion, he singled out the high-ups of government as the real culprits. Praefectura praeda. A prefecture confers license to pillage. The whole world is destroyed so that a few should bear the title of vir illustris. These were precise and bitter words. Salvian knew that the title of vir illustris conferred by high office was what gave access to the upper ranks of the nobility. Former holders of high offices and their children entered a charmed circle. It was easy for a man such as Sidonius Apollinaris to grow up as the son of a prefect. He could enjoy an evening with his friends at which there was no talk of taxes, for they were at the centre, and they were not being replaced. The social mobility of the 4th century, which had enabled members of the petty nobility, persons such as Salvian, to rise to the top as government servants, had become blocked. As John Matthews has pointed out, in mid-5th century Gaul, politics had become the preserve of the already powerful. We often speak as if the aristocracies of the West were stable and homogeneous. This was far from being the case. The members of the local elites had always varied greatly, one from the other, in their wealth and in their opportunities for advancement. The events of the 5th century had made these different layers, if anything, more factionalized, more resentful of each other. In Salvian's account, we can hear the voice of an entire group raised against what was fast becoming an isolated ancien regime, an upper aristocracy increasingly closed against newcomers and tarnished by association with the systematic fiscal violence of the Roman Empire. But when he wrote on these matters, Salvian did it his way. He presented his readers with a freak show. The ills of his time were summed up and dramatized in a series of glaring anomalies. Well-to-do Romans had begun to flee to the barbarians, for whom they had formerly fled, as Salvian himself had fled from the Rhineland. And this was because the authorities of the res publica had come to treat Roman citizens as little better than barbarians. For Salvian, the Bacaudae were a glaring example of this dire process. Branded with the opprobrious name of Bacchaudi, freeborn Romans found themselves the target of vicious campaigns of repression by the Roman armies. They were treated as if they were public enemies of the res publica. Salvian did nothing to soften the impact on his readers of this ultimate anomaly. He did not share the interest of modern historians in the emergence of new styles of what Peter Heather has called local Romanness, around barbarian courts or in the imagined no man's land of the territories controlled by the Bacchaudi. He had no sense whatsoever that a new barbarian Roman world was emerging. Rather, he looked at Gaul and Spain with the hard eyes of a man who wrote from within the territories of the res publica. He was well aware of the ideology of those who governed his region. Any province under barbarian rule was technically a province taken captive by the enemies of Rome. In a captive province, there simply should not have been Romans who were happy to be elite, happy to be over there in barbarian territory. Yet such Romans, he says, now prayed never again to become subjects of the empire. Other authors had written before about Romans who found it easier to live among barbarians. That in itself was not new. What was new was the manner in which Salvian drew attention to this flight as a terrible inversion of the normal order of things. The res publica should be a place of liberty. Augustine had said so in no uncertain terms, only a decade previously, when in the late 420s he drafted a petition to halt the slave trade in Africa. Barbarians are resisted when the Roman army is in good condition, lest Romans be held in barbarian captivity. Yet, faced by these slave traders, who will resist in the name of Roman freedom, pro libertate Romana, the common freedom of us all? Our tendency to divide up the history of the West into distinct provinces and into distinct periods measured by the lifetimes of leading figures make it difficult to believe that these words written in Africa in the last years of Augustine were written only a decade before Salvian sat down to write the De Gubernatione. But now, as Salvian pointed out, the most sinister transformation of all had taken place. It was within the res publica itself, the place of liberty, that Salvian perceived the ultimate anomaly, a new birth of captivity. It is with this that we can end. High taxation meant impoverishment. And impoverishment meant a quickening of the most sinister process of all, the enslavement of Romans by Romans within the territory of the res publica itself. Faced by the weight of taxes, poor farmers who could not emigrate did what little they could do. They handed themselves over to the rich as clients in return for protection. Such patronage by the great, so Salvian claimed, turned free men into slaves as surely as the magic of Circe had turned humans into hogs. This was an unpardonable transformation. Salvian had no objection to patronage in itself. It showed greatness of soul in a powerful man to offer help to the weak. As Cam Gray has shown, reciprocal vertical relationships were central to Salvian's view of society. We must also remember that such relations were central also in his theological views. When representatives of the Gallic consensus grappled with the problem of how to reconcile respect for the freedom of the will with a piety based on an acute sense of dependence on God, they invariably turned as to a root metaphor to the relations of patrons and clients. These were relations between free persons. They might be marked by acute dependence of the one on the other. A free man might approach the great as a bankrupt, abject client, as fallen human beings approach God. But these free clients should never be made into slaves, either by God or by the powerful. It was precisely the hint of a Circe's spell that turned free men into slaves, into mere droids, talking machines, to use the ancient term, which alarmed them in the doctrine of overriding grace propounded by Augustine and his extreme followers. The choice of social metaphors taken from client-patron relations by leaders of the Gallic consensus filtered the extreme position of Augustine, who seemed to glory in the making of slaves. We should not be misled by Salvian's dramatic picture of the actual relations between patrons and their dependents in the Gaul of the 430s. It is far from certain that such patronage represented in any way a new development. It was not necessarily a sinister harbinger of feudal links of dependence which bound the peasantry as serfs to their lords. Jens Uwe Krause has shown that the patronage which Salvian described did not mark a new departure. He was only describing the normal ups and downs of farmers forced to sell part or all of their land to richer neighbours in order to meet their tax debts. But what this de-dramatization of the phenomenon of patronage itself in Gaul does not explain is the intensity with which Salvian fastened on it. He did so for a reason that was deeply rooted in his thought on the justice of God. The justice of God was always apposite. By a relentless lex talionis, the Romans suffered at the hands of the barbarians precisely what they were inflicting on their own fellows. Nothing more, nothing less. Are we surprised that the barbarians capture us when we make captives of our own brothers? If Salvian has misled social historians of the 5th century West by exaggerating the power exercised by rural patrons over their dependents, it was because he wished his readers to know that any captivity which Romans inflicted on each other was bound to be as brutal as that which any barbarian had inflicted on the Romans. For the justice of God to stand, the one captivity, that imposed by patrons on their clients, had to be presented as just as oppressive, just as widespread, just as inexorable as was the other, the captivity of Romans among the barbarians. It was because of the sinister growth of captivity in their own society that they suffered captivity at the hands of barbarians. Labores manuum nostrarum manducamus. We are eating the bread of our own making. That is the Salvian sound. We should not underestimate its distinctiveness. A sense of society as a whole, ruled in all its parts by the law of God, gave him the lens with which to examine the interconnections of an entire society in crisis. He did this in a manner that gained him a permanent place, if only in the footnotes, in all modern attempts to analyze the Roman Empire in its last days. I hope that I've shown this afternoon that Salvian's picture remains gripping and faithful, provided that we relate it to a precise moment in the history of the Roman state. But I also hope that I've shown that the lens which enabled him to view this picture was not ground in a modern mind. It was the notion of the present judgment of God for breaches of the law which he had delivered first to Israel and then to the Christians of the Roman Empire, as on the great central scene of Christ delivering his law on the late 4th century sarcophagus from Arles, so felicitously chosen by Polly Evans for the notice of this talk. This sense of the law was what gave that lens its unmistakable shape and focus, which I have attempted to conjure up for you this afternoon. Thank you.